So getting into pressurization, remember, pressurization requires three elements. We need a pressurized air source, a container for it to go into, and then we need to control the leakage out from that container, or the outflow. And so we're going to look at outflow valves for that. So outflow valves are a controlled leakage source, which can determine the cabin pressure altitude, as well as any change or the rate of change, how quickly that altitude changes. So there's four valves that are going to be involved in this process. The first one that does most of the work is the primary outflow valve. And these come in two configurations. They can be a diaphragm type, like shown here. Or they can be a door type that we'll look at in a second. The diaphragm type and the door type actually are controlled. They can either be controlled, older aircraft, they were often controlled pneumatically, just with differential pressures, aneroids, and that kind of thing. Newer aircraft, most of them are electrically controlled, where they have a computer tied into the inputs. The pneumatic ones often didn't even have computers. They just had analog gauges and pressure. But it's going to control that cabin pressure and rate of change based on how quickly this valve opens. And this is the inside part of it. This would be on the inside of the airplane. You can see this one's got differential pressure points. This is a pneumatically controlled valve. And here's the big poppet at the bottom that allows air to go to the outside. This would be mounted on the skin of the aircraft. A door type valve, here's one that's open. And this is actually what the 727 has. Some of you saw this when we did some stuff out there. But on the right side of the plane, it is just that. It's a door that opens into the fuselage. So we try to keep it closed because it's big enough that a bird can go in and out of it. Okay, normally on the ground, these are going to be open. If you walk up to a plane sitting parked on the ground, these are almost always left open. So pressurized. Again, they can be electrically or pneumatically controlled. Most more modern ones are electrical, and it's going to do the same thing. It can vary how much it opens, right? It doesn't have to be all the way open like shown here. It can be just cracked open a little bit, or it can be opened a lot. And the faster you open it or close it, the faster you get a pressure change in the cabin. The other three valves that we have are more of a safety type valve or a backup type system. So the first of these is the positive pressure relief valve. And this is our pressure vessel, our fuselage, is going to have a maximum delta pressure, difference in pressure from the inside to the outside. For most transport aircraft, that's somewhere just shy of 9 psi, about 8.7, 8.8, 8.9, or even 9. And so what that allows is, for a transport aircraft to operate at roughly 40,000, 45,000 feet and still maintain a cabin altitude around 8,000 feet. With some new aircraft like the 787 being the big one, that can handle a higher differential pressure. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I want to say it's somewhere in the 11 to 12 psi range. What that means is they don't typically fly the aircraft much higher than normal. They fly it still in that 35 to 45,000 foot range, probably more in the 32 to 40,000 foot range. However, it means the cabin altitude can maintain lower, can stay lower. So instead of cruising with a cabin altitude of say 7,000 or 8,000 feet, they can cruise with a cabin altitude of 3,000 to 5,000 feet. And the advantage of that is it's more comfortable for passengers. It reduces things like jet lag, as well as fatigue on the crew. So this is if the outflow valve here for some reason fails to operate like it should, the pressure relief valve is going to prevent the cabin pressure from exceeding that max delta P, that 8.8, 8.9 psi. And so it's going to vent if that's the case. The other thing it'll monitor is the pressure rise. So if you get a change in pressure, if the pressure starts to spike too quickly, it will actually open before you reach that maximum delta P to prevent the delta P from shooting over that max level. So it monitors both the rate of increase as well as the pressure in the cabin, and it can open in either case. So it's going to reduce the pressure or the rate of change to an acceptable level. Okay. Our second safety valve, third valve used in the pressurization system, is a negative pressure relief valve. And these are very simple. They're found on the outside of the aircraft. They're found on the side of the aircraft, just like the others. They're a port between the inside and the outside of the aircraft. And a fuselage is designed to have pressure on the inside pushing out. It's designed, the skin is designed to be loaded in tension. And we absolutely never want to have more pressure on the outside of the fuselage than the inside. You can think about it of like a carbonated beverage, like a pop can or a beer can or an energy drink can. Before you open it, if you try to squeeze or crush one of those cans when it's pressurized inside, it's extremely strong, right? You typically can't crush easily a full can that's still sealed. But once you open that can and empty it, if you grab it and squeeze it, you can crush it really, really easily. Okay? That's a case of where there's more pressure on the outside than on the inside. The fuselage works the same way. So a negative pressure relief valve, it's either a door like this, that's what Boeing uses, for instance, and it's just, all it is a door with a spring that, it's a plug type door. So it just gets forced against the inside of the skin and closes that off. And there's a spring to kind of hold it there so it doesn't flop open. But if there's pressure, it's pushing it shut. If the pressure starts to go negative, that door just swings open. It's basically a check valve that allows air into the fuselage if the pressure gets too low. The other style is a poppet like this. This plate in the center can push away from this rim. You can see there's kind of some springs around the outside just to help hold it shut. But the main thing is the pressure inside the fuselage is going to hold this shut anytime that it's pressurized. But it's going to prevent that condition that could cause a catastrophic failure if that pressure outside got too high. And this is if, for some reason, the outflow valves fail to open as the plane is descending and you don't have a good air source into the aircraft. So it's kind of it's not a very common scenario, but if that air source, if your pneumatic source isn't keeping up with the air flowing or the pressure increase, then this door will open to help augment that. The last one, the last safety valve, or the third safety valve, fourth valve in a pressurization system, is the dump valve. And this is used to release pressure under normal and abnormal conditions. So on the ground, a true dump valve, if it's a butterfly type, is often fully open or fully closed. Okay? There can also be door type outflow valves where the dump valve and the door valve are essentially the same thing. It just operates in two different functions. And so here again, electrical or pneumatic operation. In flight, the purpose of the dump valve is to release cabin pressure in an emergency. Remember when we talked about airflow, the pressurized air, the bleed air coming into the airplane, typically comes in through the ceiling and at the nose. And the airflow through the cabin is from the front and the top down and back, where the outflow valves are at the back of the fuselage. So with a dump valve, if we release cabin pressure in an emergency, that is going to suck everything in the cabin down and back and hopefully clear the cockpit first if, say, it's full of smoke or chemical contamination. Okay. The second function is that this is going to open on the ground. When the aircraft goes weight on wheels, the dump valve is going to open to prevent the airplane from pressurizing on the ground unless you override it in a manual mode. Okay. So on the ground, there's no reason to pressurize, except for maintenance. We do it sometimes to test operation of, say, the other valves of the pressurization valve. Okay. If you look at where these are located or how they kind of work, here's our, an airplane. They show kind of where the outflow valve is. Here's the positive pressure, negative pressure on the back pressure bulkhead here. This one, they don't put the outflow valve on the bottom, but the dump valve. I believe the positive pressure can also be a dump valve in this case for evacuation. Okay. And these are, depending on the aircraft, can be different configurations, different redundancy configurations, but ultimately kind of all work together. Some valves can sometimes do both. Often the outflow valve and the dump valve can be interchangeable. In fact, on some aircraft, the outflow valve and the dump valve are the same valve. They work different depending on where they're installed. Okay. So, yeah. This shows a butterfly type dump valve as well. You can have a butterfly type outflow or dump valve. And then that poppet valve and positive pressure valve. Okay. With these systems, there's 3 modes of operation that an aircraft pressurization system can operate in. The simplest one, and what is essentially the same as what you have on a small Cessna, the Cirrus, whatever, is an unpressurized mode. In unpressurized, the plane, basically the pressurization system is shut off and the dump valve, the outflow valve, are kept open the entire time. The second one is isobaric, is that is where we maintain a specific cabin altitude. And that just as the plane, if the aircraft climbs or descends, it's still going to maintain a given cabin altitude that's below the altitude the aircraft's at. And then the third is constant differential, and that's what happens as we get up to the higher altitudes. There's a max differential. Basically, the plane is going to keep the cabin as low as it can without exceeding that differential pressure. And often you see more than one used in a given flight. And the most common that are combined, isobaric and constant differential, are almost always used together during the course of a flight. During the climb phase, when we're not to a point where the differential pressure would be too high, the aircraft starts in isobaric mode. But then once we reach the max differential pressure, we switch to a constant differential, where if the aircraft continues to climb, then the cabin altitude is going to climb as well. Okay. So these look like separate, unpressurized here, and we have our altitude on the left in red and blue. Okay, our differential pressures in green, differential pressure amounts on the right. And here you have red as aircraft altitude, blue is cabin altitude, and green is differential. This should look similar. You guys had to sketch this in one of the labs. Okay. So here's an isobaric mode example. So here, the cabin altitude we're keeping the same. You can see as the aircraft altitude increases or changes, it's going to change the differential pressure. Right, as the altitude of the aircraft increases, if we want the cabin to stay the same, then the differential pressure is going to have to increase. And that's what's happening here during the cruise phase. Okay. Compare that with constant differential, where we keep our differential constant, in this case about just over 6 psi, for instance. So here there's about a 20,000 foot difference between cabin and aircraft. And then if we were to keep that constant differential, you can see here, now we still have that 20,000 foot difference between cabin and outside. Now, in this case, it's not a great diagram I made because it's going above 10,000 feet. The crew would have to be wearing supplemental oxygen as well at that point. So I got to kind of tweak these a little bit, but it gives you an idea of what's happening. But like I said, typically isobaric would often be used during the climb until we get to that max DP allowed by the aircraft. And then it would switch over to constant differential to maintain, as low of a cabin altitude as possible at a given aircraft altitude. Okay. That's it for pressurization and environmental control and all that.